Have you ever had a friend who enjoys keeping you humble, who makes it their aim to just humble you all the time? For example, let's say you start talking with someone that you really want to impress, and your friend jumps right in the conversation and shares an embarrassing story about you that is humiliating. Or maybe your friend slaps you on the back and says, "Don't listen to this guy. He has no idea what he's talking about." Well, one of my friends, I have a friend like that. I think everyone should have a friend like that. He's taken the responsibility upon himself to keep me humble whenever I try to sound smart or impressive to anyone. And his way of keeping me humble is by asking me this question every time I try to sound smart. I'll say something cool or whatever, and he'll ask me, "Okay, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are?" Let's say I read a new book, and I'm like, I want to share it. I read this cool thing. He'll say, "Who do you think you are?" Or I'll tell him a story about somewhere I got to travel, some exotic, cool place. He'll say, "Who do you think you are?" It's become an inside joke for the two of us whenever we hang out, for him to ask me, "Okay, Josh, who do you think you are?" Well, that's the question that many people were asking Jesus after listening to him preach the Sermon on the Mount. After listening to Jesus' teaching, likely over the course of a few days, people were asking Jesus, "Okay, Jesus, who do you think you are?" And the reason why they were asking Jesus, "Who do you think you are?" is because, as Matthew tells us at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in 28 and 29, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. The crowds were shocked, and a better translation of that word would be dumbfounded, that Jesus had the audacity to teach people how they should live their lives. Jesus preaches his Sermon on the Mount at the very beginning of his public ministry. He's a rising star. He's trending on Twitter. He's a supposed miracle worker, and crowds of people from all over are flocking from Palestine to hear him speak. They've heard all sorts of rumors about this Jesus character, and so people walk miles and miles to hear him teach with their own ears. And what some people were expecting to hear from Jesus was something of a boring sermon or lecture, like the religious leaders of the day were known to give, where he would quote what this famous rabbi had said, or that famous rabbi had said about the Bible and about the law. Right? Have you ever experienced this where you open up a textbook for school and you realize maybe halfway through that you've just been reading what everyone else thinks about a topic? You read page and page and page of what this expert wrote, or that expert wrote, this scholar wrote, or that scholar wrote, and it's always their last names that pop up together. So it's Frankel and May, it's Maslow and Wilbur think this or that. That's what the Jewish scribes were like. That's what their tradition, their profession was geared towards. They enjoyed making sure people knew just how smart and intelligent and professional they were, because they could quote from memory what many well-respected rabbis had said. Jesus, however, does something that no Jewish scholar in their right mind would ever do. He sat down and he taught the people not what other people thought was the right way to live as a member of God's kingdom, but what he thought was the right way to live as a member of God's kingdom. And he did so as if he was God himself. To everyone's surprise, Jesus wasn't participating in a scholarly debate about what the Bible could mean. He was telling people exactly what the Bible meant and how they ought to live in light of it. Jesus wasn't adding his opinion to the rabbinic tradition about what various laws from the Hebrew Bible or what you could eat, what you couldn't eat might mean. He was declaring the one and only true interpretation of the law, which he presupposed was his own. The crowds were shocked by the sense of authority, strong authority, that Jesus seemed to believe he had as their teacher, an authority that no well-respected Jewish rabbi or scribe would have ever thought to claim for themselves. Well, much like the crowds who would have first listened to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we too have a problem with authority. We just don't like people telling us how to live our lives. And we often view anyone who claims to have authority over us with instant skepticism, asking questions in our minds like, what are they trying to get from me? What's in it for them? Well, today as we begin this new sermon series on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, I just want to talk about two things. First, I want to talk about some of the reasons why I think we struggle with authority. And second, what sets Jesus apart, what makes him different from any authority figure you've ever known. So those are the two things that we're going to talk about this morning. First, why are we skeptical of people with authority? Why are we skeptical of people with authority? Well, one of the first reasons why I think we're skeptical and struggle with people with authority is because of how many examples there are out there in the world of how power and authority have been corrupted and abused. You just turn on the TV, you look through your feed on Facebook, and you can read story after story of how people, men and women in power and authority, have used that power for their own gain at the expense of others. A friend from grad school recently shared publicly on Facebook how he had experienced various forms of spiritual abuse while serving in a ministry that he really loved and cared for deeply. He was doing so while promoting a new book published that I'd highly recommend you read, titled Bully Pulpit, Confronting the Problem of Spiritual Abuse in the Church. A popular podcast, which Mel and I listened to many episodes of a couple months ago, told the story of how one of the fastest growing churches out here in the Pacific Northwest collapsed overnight due to how its lead pastor abused his power and authority to command and control his church and his staff in deeply hurtful ways. We're often skeptical of people with authority because of the many stories that we've heard and read and listened to about how people with authority abused it to hurt, deeply hurt others. So that's one reason. A second reason why I think we're skeptical of people with authority has to do with our family. Because for most of us, the closest, most obvious authority figures in our lives happen to be our parents. And how we relate to our own parents definitely shapes how we view authority. We're skeptical of people with authority because our parents, who are the most obvious authority figures in our lives, as good parents do or have the tendency to do, tell us how we should live our lives. And some of us, I think we're kind of tired of it. And this is regardless of how old you may be or what age you might be. Who's ever had it happen that your mom or dad calls you out of the blue and you really don't want to pick up the phone because you know what you're going to have to sit through. You're going to have to listen to them tell you how you need to exercise more, how you need to eat better, and how they know that you're doing this thing that you like right now, but they really think you should be doing something totally different. We're tired of our parents telling us of how to live our lives, and so that makes us automatically skeptical and hesitant to listen to anyone who tries to do the same. We think, okay, this guy is really starting to sound like a lecture from my parents, and we tune them out, as we've learned to do over the years. That's the second reason why. A third reason, and the final reason why I think we're often skeptical of people with authority in our lives, is that we live in a city who arguably it has as its highest value self-expression and individualism. Nowhere in the U.S. is there a stronger conviction that you alone have the right to choose the way to live your life than here in Portland, Oregon. That's kind of what makes Portland, Portland. Letting any other person but yourself tell you how to live your life is seen as fundamentally inauthentic. Even though many of us were not necessarily born and raised here in Portland, we're still shaped by the culture that we live in. It's in the water that we drink, the air that we breathe. The values of self-expression and individualism are celebrated and praised in our workplaces, and some of us have had to sit through courses on how to be trained to be respectful and accepting of however anyone chooses to live, so long as it doesn't hurt anyone else. Right? Portland's slogan, "Keep Portland Weird," communicates the idea that giving people the freedom to live however they want and however they may choose to define themselves is what makes Portland, Portland. It's what makes us cool. And yet, as countercultural as Portland portrays itself, there is a very dominant and singular cultural narrative in our city about what matters most. And the Western individualistic values of self-expression, self-love, and self-determination are at the very top of that list. And so this combination of constant stories and examples of people who've abused and misused their authority to hurt and wound others, our own weariness and exhaustion of hearing our parents and relatives tell us how to live our lives, combined with the individualistic and self-expressive culture of the city that we live, work, and play in every day, all work to make us immediately and automatically skeptical of anyone with authority in our lives. And at this stage, I just want us to recognize that that's a part of who we are and that we bring that skepticism with us every time we open up the Bible, even to Jesus and to his Sermon on the Mount. Now let's move on to our second question. What makes Jesus different from any authority figure you've ever known? What makes Jesus different from any authority figure you've ever known? Well, one of the first things that people pay attention to about a preacher is whether or not that preacher practices what they preach, right? Do they practice what they preach? And the same can be asked of Jesus, who was a preacher, who preaches this sermon and was a teacher as well. Does Jesus practice what he preaches in the Sermon on the Mount? Or does he show us just another cliched example of someone who talked the talk but did not walk the walk? Well, when you read through Matthew's gospel, the section that follows right after Jesus' Sermon on the Mount includes story after story of Jesus' miracles. And miracles are weird, and I get that, and if you want to talk about that, we can do so. But right after the Sermon on the Mount, you see Jesus doing miracles. In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus cleanses a man with a debilitating skin disease. He heals the servant of a Roman soldier. He heals one of his own apostles' mother-in-law, Peter, who is sick with a fever. He sets free the spiritually oppressed. He calms a storm. In Matthew 9, he heals a paralytic man. He heals a woman who'd been suffering from a discharge of blood for 12 years. And he raises a girl from the dead. 2 blind men receive their sight. A mute man is able to speak again. All of the miracles that Jesus does are public demonstrations of his power and authority as God in human flesh. And they show us, all of his miracles show us how Jesus uses his power and his authority. He uses his power and authority to heal the sick, the blind, the mute, the deaf, and the outcast, even the dead. He doesn't use his power to abuse people or to take advantage of them, as so many people with authority do. What sets Jesus apart from any authority figure you've ever known or met is that he always uses his power and authority for the good and the restoration of others. He's the one person in human history who has perfectly practiced everything that he preached. Many people, religious and non-religious, consider Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as some of the most beautiful advice for how we should live our lives as a decent human being. And you don't have, and many people will argue, you can appreciate the Sermon on the Mount whether you're a Christian or not. People will read the Beatitudes that start, which we'll take a look at next week, which start off, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And a lot of people will hear that, and they'll think to themselves, wow, that just sounds so wonderful. An American missionary by the name of Eli Stanley Jones wrote a book called Christ at the Round Table, which was based on conversations that he had with the leaders of very many different religions in India. And the purpose of these roundtable discussions was simply to talk together, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Christian, of various traditions, about what they had each learned about God through their own personal experiences. And according to him, one of the conference attendees, a Hindu professor, said to him, this is what he said, "The Jesus of dogma, of doctrine, I do not understand. But the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount and the cross, I love and am drawn to." That sounds kind of nice. We might initially be like, okay, yeah, that sounds good. But this view that there are these two opposite and opposing kinds of Jesuses, one Jesus who is a spiritual teacher among many, adding his little bit of wisdom to the world, and this other Jesus, who is the Jesus of the New Testament, represents a fundamental misreading of the Bible and of the Sermon on the Mount. If you've ever read the Sermon on the Mount, there are these little passages that will stick out to you because they sound absolutely outrageous for anyone, for any human being to say. And what I think you'll find as we go through this sermon series, through the Sermon of the Mount, is as you read it and pay attention to it, you'll actually find yourself beginning to feel really bad, really terrible. You'll become deeply discouraged because what you'll start to realize if you're really paying attention is that the standards that Jesus sets for how his followers are to live are unattainably high on our own. For example, Jesus teaches in Matthew 5:21-22 that though people had heard it was said, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment." What does Jesus have to say about that? Jesus says, "Everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire." Jesus taught that any thought, word, or deed that treats another person as less than human, any word that we speak which belittles them, which makes us worthy of judgment. Right? Have you ever talked down to someone as if they were beneath you or worthless even once? If you have, as I've done before, then according to Jesus, you and I both deserve what, not my words, but Jesus' words, the hell of fire. That's how high, extraordinarily high, Jesus' standards are for the members of his kingdom. That's how seriously Jesus takes the words that we speak and that we say to one another. Speech that strips other people of their dignity as creatures made in God's image is deserving of eternal judgment. That sounds crazy. But that's the very point of the Sermon on the Mount as we read it, and you'll see this more clearly. The point of the Sermon on the Mount is to show you clearly that you cannot live according to this teaching by yourself. The point of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is to show you that on your own, there's no hope for you. None at all. God's standards for morality and ethics are so infinitely higher than the standards that we have set for ourselves. No salvation is possible for you on your own. It's only when you stop trying to fix yourself. It's only when you stop trying to save yourself. It's only when you stop trying to be better next time and confess to Jesus, "I can't do it," I need your help, then you will be saved. Right? Jesus didn't just come to give some good advice about how we should live our lives. He didn't come just to add a little bit to us to improve us. He came to give us his life, to die for our sins, and to make us a completely new person. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount reminds us that the only way we can live well and we can live rightly in this world is if we know him, we trust him, and rely utterly and completely on him and what he's done for us on the cross. What sets Jesus apart from any authority figure you've ever known is that he doesn't just give you good life advice, he gives you himself so that you can become a radically new person and start living a radically new life. Well, in contrast with our city and its dominant cultural narrative that the answer to who you are is found within yourself, I think Jesus says something that's truly countercultural. He says that the pathway to discover who you really are, the pathway to self-actualization, is not actually found in you. Actually, according to Jesus, the more you focus on yourself, the more frustrated and exhausted and weary you will become. Jesus says this to his disciples in Matthew 16:24-25. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. If you've grown up in the church, you've heard these words before, and they may sound familiar to you, but try to remember what it was like for you to hear them for the very first time. Doesn't it sound completely ridiculous for Jesus to say something like that? Doesn't it sound insane? How could Jesus say something as narcissistic as deny yourself, everybody, take up your cross and follow me, and if you forget yourself, if you let go of your life for me, you'll find it. But that's exactly the kind of stuff that Jesus says all the time, and we're going to hear and encounter a lot of that through the Sermon on the Mount. He says that if you're willing to let go of yourself for him, then you'll find yourself with him. The pathway to finding who you truly are and who you were always meant to be starts and ends with Jesus. The last thing that sets Jesus apart from any authority figure you've ever known is that he helps you find yourself in the weirdest way possible by forgetting yourself and following him. Today we talked about some of the reasons why we're skeptical of authority in our lives. There are examples everywhere in stories of how people have abused authority to hurt and wound others. Another reason why we're skeptical is because of our own weariness with having to hear our parents and relatives tell us how we ought to live our lives. And the city and culture we live in shape our initial response, our automatic response to anyone who claims to have authority in us. But Jesus is different from any other authority figure in our lives because he always uses his power and his authority to serve and heal others. Because he didn't come just to give people good life advice, but to give them himself. And lastly, because he helps us find ourselves by letting go of ourselves and following him. As we go through this sermon series, I want us just to be aware of and acknowledge the skepticism that all of us, myself included, are going to be bringing to Jesus. And I also want us to be aware of and remember what sets Jesus apart from any other authority that we've ever known. And as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, I also want to encourage you, regardless if you call yourself a Christian, regardless if you've been baptized or not, to continue asking that same question everyone was asking after they first heard Jesus preach his sermon. Jesus, who do you think you are? Let's pray together. Father, thank you so much for Jesus and just how weird and strange he is the more we actually get to know him. Lord, you know our struggles with authority because we have been ourselves hurt. We ourselves have been abused. We ourselves have been wounded deeply by how the authority figures in our lives have misused authority against us. Lord, we acknowledge that the culture that we live in makes us hesitant and skeptical of anyone with authority. And Lord, we pray that as we go through this Sermon on the Mount, that you would help us, that you would be gracious to us, that you might show us more of who Jesus really and truly is, and that in doing so, we would follow him with our whole lives. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.